Tonight, we begin with something unprecedented in modern Russian history. A breakdown happening not in the streets or parliament, but inside the one institution Vladimir Putin believed he controlled absolutely, which is the Russian military. Sources say Russian generals are refusing orders, not with public statements or resignations, but through systematic delay and bureaucratic resistance. Intelligence officials describe this as passive defiance on a scale never seen before in Putin's Russia. Here is what is happening right now. Putin issues orders for military operations that NATO has explicitly warned would trigger immediate retaliation. His commanders acknowledge those orders, but then nothing happens because the orders disappear into layers of military procedure and operational reviews that never conclude, or into logistical assessments that stretch for weeks. According to officials briefed on classified intelligence, this pattern has been developing for months and represents a fundamental crisis in how power operates inside Russia. For over 2 decades, Putin built his authority on the simple principle that the military obeys without question. But that principle is collapsing. When an authoritarian system loses the compliance of its enforcers, the entire structure becomes unstable. Intelligence assessments suggest the breaking point came after catastrophic losses in Ukraine, when Putin began demanding actions his generals viewed as suicidal, such as strikes on NATO infrastructure or provocative operations near alliance borders. NATO responded with direct warnings delivered through private intelligence channels, making clear that certain actions would be met with overwhelming military force against Russian command centers and the generals themselves. Faced with that reality, sources say Russian military leadership made a collective decision to preserve the institution, even if it means defying the man who leads it. This is where the situation becomes dangerous, because Putin knows something is wrong. Operations that should take days are taking weeks, and directives are stalling while his generals provide explanations like equipment failures or weather delays. But according to intelligence officials, Putin understands his military is protecting itself by ignoring him. The question consuming analysts at the Pentagon and CIA is, what does Putin do when he realizes his conventional military will not follow him into disaster? A weakened autocrat is not necessarily safer than a confident one, because desperation breeds escalation. If Putin concludes his generals are unreliable, he may seek options that bypass military command structures entirely, or options that require smaller circles of loyalists. CIA assessments indicate Putin is aware of the resistance because orders are vanishing and operations are postponed indefinitely. Purging the entire military leadership would be an admission of catastrophic weakness. So instead, officials describe a stalemate where Putin issues orders and the military performs loyalty. But between command and execution, a new reality takes shape. The alliance has drawn precise red lines, not to provoke Russia, but to communicate directly with Russian military commanders. The message is explicit that if you execute certain orders, you personally will face consequences because your bases will be targeted and your command centers will be struck while your careers and lives are at risk. It is a calculated gamble, according to senior officials, representing a bet that Russian generals value survival more than they fear Putin. So far, that bet appears correct, but officials acknowledge the inherent danger, because if Putin feels cornered or believes his own military has turned against him, his response could be unpredictable. State Department officials point to historical patterns where the final phase of authoritarian regimes often looks like orders given but not followed, along with loyalty that exists in appearance only. Institutions stop functioning while maintaining the facade of normality. But those same officials note that collapsing authoritarian power rarely ends peacefully, especially when the autocrat controls nuclear weapons. Pentagon assessments show Putin attempting to reassert control through intimidation, where officers who question strategy too openly have been reassigned or vanished from public view. But sources say the resistance is too widespread for fear tactics to work, because this is not a small group of dissidents, but a broad consensus within the officer corps that Putin's judgment has failed. Intelligence intercepts reveal conversations inside the Russian Ministry of Defense regarding contingencies about what happens if Putin orders the use of tactical nuclear weapons and whether such orders would be legal or could even be executed. Officials stress these are not plans, but preparations. Yet the fact that Russian officers are having these conversations signals how seriously the command structure is considering the possibility that Putin may reach for weapons of last resort. NATO has made unambiguous that any nuclear use would trigger immediate and devastating response. But the question keeping officials awake is whether Putin believes that threat and whether his military would stop him if he decided to test it. Sources say the United States has opened quiet channels to Russian military leadership, not to negotiate or offer deals, but to ensure that if Putin issues an order that leads to catastrophe, there are people in the chain of command who understand the stakes and have the ability to prevent it. This represents an extraordinary situation for a nuclear power, where the head of state may lack full control over his armed forces, and where orders may or may not be followed depending on subordinate judgment. Here is what officials fear most. If Putin realizes his conventional military is no longer loyal, he may bypass it and turn to intelligence services or special units with unconditional loyalty, or systems that do not require broad military consensus. If that happens, the institutional safeguards that have prevented the worst outcomes may no longer matter. According to intelligence assessments, Putin is isolated and his circle of trusted advisors has shrunk. So officials who once provided candid assessments now tell him what he wants to hear. In that isolation, his perception of reality and his options may be dangerously distorted. Russian military officers, meanwhile, find themselves in an impossible position, caught between orders they believe are insane and a leader they fear but no longer trust. Their solution has been passive resistance by acknowledging commands but not executing them, while protecting the institution from destruction. But that solution only works if Putin accepts it. And sources say there are signs he is growing impatient. Demands for explanations have become more frequent. Pressure on commanders has intensified. The bureaucratic delays that protected officers from having to refuse orders directly are becoming harder to sustain. Intelligence officials describe this as a race between Putin's realization that his military is defying him and the potential for diplomatic resolution that would remove the need for escalation, between his desperation and the calculations of generals trying to keep Russia from self-destruction. Here is where NATO finds itself. The alliance must maintain deterrence without pushing Putin into a corner, must communicate resolve without triggering the very escalation it seeks to prevent, must support Ukraine while managing the risk that a desperate autocrat makes catastrophic choices. Officials describe it as the most delicate balance since the Cold War. Every military move is calculated, not just for battlefield effect, but for psychological impact on Putin and his generals. Every diplomatic message is crafted to leave room for de-escalation while making consequences crystal clear. And underlying everything is the knowledge that miscalculation could be disastrous, that the gap between what Putin believes is happening and what is actually happening creates space for decisions based on false assumptions. Sources say intelligence agencies are working to ensure Putin has accurate information about Western intentions, that he understands NATO is not seeking regime change, that alliance red lines are about preventing escalation, not threatening Russia itself. But whether those messages reach Putin through layers of advisors telling him what they think he wants to hear remains uncertain. Here is what this means going forward. The war in Ukraine continues, but the real crisis now may be inside the Kremlin. A leader losing control, a military protecting itself through defiance, and nuclear weapons in the middle of a power struggle that neither side can afford to lose. Intelligence officials say the next weeks will be critical. Putin will either accept the new reality and adjust his strategy, or he will attempt to reassert control in ways that could destabilize everything. His generals will either maintain their resistance or conclude that the risk of defying him has become too great. And NATO will continue to watch, to draw lines, to communicate both resolve and restraint, hoping that the message reaches not just Putin, but the officers who would have to execute his orders. What happens next depends on decisions being made right now in Moscow, in the Kremlin, where Putin calculates his options, in military headquarters, where generals weigh survival against loyalty, in command centers, where officers prepare for possibilities no one wants to consider. Officials across Washington and allied capitals are asking questions no one can answer with certainty. When an autocrat loses control of his military, does he step back? Does he find new ways to assert power? Or does he choose destruction over admission of weakness? Right now, we do not know. But sources say we will find out soon. The situation cannot remain in this state of suspended crisis indefinitely. Something will break. The question is what, and what the consequences will be when it does. This is where we stand tonight. Vladimir Putin facing defiance from the institution he built his power on. Russian generals choosing preservation over obedience. And the entire structure of Russian military authority caught in a crisis that could reshape everything about how this war ends and how the world responds to what comes next.